Good evening. I am Lucas McMillan, Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. On behalf of Scott Jones, our Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at Lander University, it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Whether you are here in our Josephine Abney Cultural Center auditorium or whether you are joining us online. The Jackson Lecture Series is a highlight of any academic year. It is because it brings a distinguished guest to our campus. Over the years, we have benefited from hearing from celebrated scholars, journalists, and public intellectuals. We last gathered for this occasion in January 2020. Tonight's topic promises to be enlightening because it reminds us to continue investigating topics we think we know well. Holly Pinheiro's research shows that one must continue asking questions, digging for more research, and thinking about things in new ways. His forthcoming book and previous scholarship showed the benefits of new lenses and frameworks for famous topics. The program that we have in your hands tonight provides some details about the Jackson Lecture Series and the man whose memory it honors. I want to say a little more about Larry Jackson to ensure that all who gather tonight understand how President Jackson's contributions are still with us today. Like most Lander students, Larry Jackson was a native South Carolinian, and when he became Lander's president in 1973, he had traveled not very far from his hometown of Florence. But in the intervening decades, he had vigorously pursued and received opportunities to see and to study the world. He had seen the beauty and the complexity of the world. He had seen the horrors of war, something that is arguably on our minds tonight. Because Larry Jackson had served in the Army Air Corps as a navigator on bombers during World War II. But following graduation from Wofford, he went back to Europe with a Quaker group to see and to seek reconciliation and reconstruction in Germany. Returning to the United States, he studied with Niebuhr and Tillich at Union Theological Seminary in New York and became a United Methodist pastor. He then moved his family to Latin America and served as a headmaster of a girls' preparatory school in Chile. At the University of the Pacific, Larry Jackson created a study abroad program in India and took his family to live in Bangalore for a year. And then he created another study abroad program in England for the University of Evansville. So thus, before scholars had come up with complex interdependence theory and before globalization was coined as a term, Larry Jackson understood our interconnected world. Among his lasting legacies at Lander are our study abroad program and our commitment to the breadth and depth of the liberal arts education. Larry Jackson was a model for lifelong learning, and he wrestled with topics such as American power. He sometimes took risk by challenging policy and social norms, such as co-authoring a book that argued for racial integration in the 1950s. Both Larry and Barbara Jackson continued to ponder and to wonder and think about the world, something we hope our students will do long after graduation. Upon retirement in 1992, the Jacksons stayed in Greenwood and continued to support Lander. Dr. Jackson passed away in 2017, but Mrs. Jackson continues to champion our students, whether they are on the basketball court, in our choirs, or presenting their own research on a panel. And so we're so glad that the university's former First Lady is here with us tonight. Mrs. Jackson, please wave and let us congratulate you. And thank you for all that you have done for our university. So for these many reasons, we are proud to be back in this room for tonight's lecture. It promises to be special, and we look forward to learning more about our nation's history from our distinguished speaker. I need to get out of the way, but I do have two key messages. Number one, please silence your cell phones. We don't want these interrupting our program. And second, please stay with us until our program concludes and join us afterwards in the Johnston Commons for reception. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Dr. Kevin Witherspoon to introduce our speaker. Dr. Witherspoon is Professor of History at Lander and holds the Dr. Benjamin E. Mays Endowed Chair and has coordinated tonight's event.
Thank you, Lucas, and welcome everyone here this evening, whether you're here in the auditorium or watching online. But I'm particularly pleased to see everyone who is here in the room as we work our way back towards normality for these kinds of events. Online sessions are good and useful, but there's something particularly invigorating about being up in front of a few hundred people in a room like this. So I'm so glad to see all of you here. I had followed Dr. Pinheiro on Twitter for some time, keeping track of his many varied and interesting professional accomplishments, before he posted one day that he had accepted a position at Furman University. That very day, I sent him a message. This is not a word-for-word quote, but something along the lines of, "Welcome to the upstate. Here are a few restaurants you might try, and when can we get you down to Lander?" I was so excited to see a scholar of his caliber joining us in the upstate, and I'm even more excited that he is now with us on our campus and here tonight for this presentation. As noted, he is Assistant Professor of History at Furman University. He completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Central Florida, master's and PhD at the University of Iowa, and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Alabama. He just commented to me a few minutes ago that his move to the Greenville area was the 30th move of his life. Coming from a military background, he is well-traveled both nationally and internationally, which I think informs in many ways his scholarship and research, and I think that will be conveyed in his words tonight. He was previously a member of the faculty at Augusta University, where he was recognized in 2020 with the Teaching Excellence Award. He's published numerous articles and book chapters and has an extensive and impressive array of online publications and interviews, which we may talk a little bit about during the Q&A, and I encourage you to check out some of his online contributions as well. The most notable is a book that is not yet in print. My one regret for his being here this evening is that we don't have his book in our hands yet, but it will be coming in June of this year, The Family Civil War, Northern African American Soldiers, and the Fight for Racial Justice. I'm eager to read it and eager to hear his comments tonight. So, help me welcome, please, Dr. Pinheiro.
Can you hear me? Good? Back? All right. Let me turn my phone off. So you'll see that the book title has actually changed. This is The Joys, and I put quotes around that, of academic publishing. The new title is The Family Civil War, Black Soldiers, and the Fight for Racial Justice. It will be out June 15th. It's available for pre-order. Get the paperback. It's a lot cheaper. I'm serious. Get the paperback. All right. I would like to start by thanking the Jackson Lecture Series, and I'm sorry if I butcher names, it's not on purpose, President Richard Constantino, Provost Scott Jones, Dean Lucas McMillan, the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, Donna Knight, and Dr. Witherspoon for making this event possible. I do not take this for granted, and as I was saying before, I used to be the student that wallowed in self-pity that nobody cared about my work. So the fact that you're here means a lot, and I will just say that this project is actually a way for me to understand my family. Right, so as Dr. Witherspoon pointed out, my mother served in the Navy for 25 years. I was actually raised in Australia, had an accent, and they put me in ESL when we moved back to the States. Living in Miami, Florida in the 80s, I'll let you think about what that was like. It was interesting. All right. So also, just as a disclaimer, the images that I'm going to show are not necessarily of the people that I'm researching, but it's still important that we put some images to this important story. On April 8th, 1884, Mary Williamson, the widow of Benjamin Davis, a deceased 6th United States Colored Infantry or USCI soldier, met with the Bureau of Pensions at their local branch office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Williamson came to provide testimony to a special examiner about the circumstances of the minor's pension case for her now adult son, Jerome. Now, during the deposition of what was a 2+ year long investigation, the presiding pension agent, who was a white man, questioned the legitimacy of Williamson's common law marriage to her husband and the legitimacy of their child. Now, maybe Williamson had grown tired of having to explain herself to a federal government representative, as she had emphasized how the Civil War forever changed her family. And I'm going to be honest, when I read this quote, I was so shocked, because this is not what I anticipated in the record. But here's a discourse between these two people. Quote, "I kept him, Jerome Davis, until he was 7 or 8 months old, when I took him to his grandfather's at his father's request, and he, his grandfather, has brought him up and took him ever since 1864. What is the reason you do not keep or care for him? Because I had to go to service, and they were willing to care for him. They, the United States Army, drafted men and left me no means of support for ourselves." End quote. Now, Williamson's statement illustrates, I believe, the harsh reality that she and countless other working poor African Americans in Philadelphia and arguably throughout the North experienced during and long after the Civil War ended. Scholarship of United States Colored Troop or USCT regiments has long emphasized aspects of military service such as wartime mobilization, and rightly so, as USCT soldiers sacrificed their lives for the greater good of the United States and for their enslaved brethren. Some soldiers used their service as a direct pathway for African American male suffrage. Others served to have their manhood recognized by white society. The lived experiences of working poor African American USCT soldiers' families, however, has unfortunately been long overlooked. Now, Williamson's testimony sheds light, I believe, on how the war tore African American Philadelphian husbands from wives, fathers from children, children from parents, and friends from friends. The USCT was pivotal in carrying out the United States military objectives. Yet, the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of able-bodied African American men into the United States Army devastated their families for multiple generations. Some families were left to grieve and struggle economically after their male kin unfortunately died in service. Other families tended to disabilities, physical, emotional, and psychological, of the surviving veterans while also fighting to survive financially. Now, briefly, I just want to touch on some of the historiography of how I got to this book, and I believe it's necessary to situate it within the previous scholarship. Now, even though there is a wealth of USCT scholarship, one might forget that it was not until the 1950s when modern scholars recognized the historical significance of USCT soldiers. Frederick M. Binder and Dudley Taylor Cornish, for example, published studies that provided overviews of the USCT events. Then in 1965, James McPherson, which is a book I read when I was a junior and it changed my world, followed suit with an examination on the processes of wartime mobilization and the immediate post-war issues, primarily look at African American male suffrage. Collectively, these studies sought to illuminate what was believed to be a forgotten past. Quote, "The history of the Negro soldier in the Union Army has remained an obscure chapter in American history," end quote, Cornish wrote. For white non-academics and scholars, this statement was perhaps correct, but numerous African Americans knew otherwise. For example, during the late 19th and early 20th century, historical analyses of USCT regiments primarily came from African Americans. African American civilian William Wells Brown composed his monograph, The Negro in the American Rebellion, His Heroism and His Fidelity, in 1867 after noticing that white historians either downplayed or ignored black soldiers' experiences. When he wrote, quote, "I waited patiently before beginning this work with the hope that someone more competent would take up the subject at hand. But up to the present, it has not been done, although many books have been written about the rebellion," end quote. The literature of William J. Simmons, George Washington Williams, Joseph T. Wilson, Alexander Heritage Newton, and Isaac J. Hill all investigated the wartime sacrifices as well of black soldiers. Meanwhile, some USCT veterans made it their personal mission to inform civilians, including Carter G. Woodson, Happy Black History Month, about the wartime exploits. But I also want to acknowledge arguably one of the most important. And during my interview with the New York Times over the weekend, I made sure that we put respect on people like Susie King Taylor. Now, she was a formerly enslaved woman who will publish her experiences as a laundress and a nurse in the 33rd United States Colored Infantry, but also, just as important, the post-war struggles for her veteran husband, Edward, who will be unable to resume his work as a carpenter, not because of skill, but because of his race. Thus, African Americans and their white allies fought for inclusion in historical memory that did not materialize until the modern civil rights movement. Now, 5 of the men that I mentioned previously served in northern USCT regiments. Simmons enlisted in the 41st USCI, Wilson served in the 54th Massachusetts, connected to Glory, Williams served in the 13th USCI, and Newton and Hill both served in the 29th USCI out of Connecticut. Afterwards, all of these men became historians to confront whites, scholars, and non-academics, and even some African Americans who were forgetting the experiences and sacrifices of black soldiers. Simmons, for instance, lamented in 1887 of the fact that his students, most likely at the Simmons College in Kentucky, knew little of black soldiers. When he wrote, quote, "I have noticed in my long experience as a teacher that some of my students are woefully ignorant of the work of our great colored men, even ignorant of their names," end quote. Ultimately, the Family Civil War builds upon the efforts that began over 130 years ago to uncover the personal histories of the soldiers and their families. And this includes fictive kin, which I'm happy to talk about at the Q&A, in a manner that will bring their lives and experiences to the forefront. Now, at least for Simmons, his book's monograph dedication allowed him to honor the prominent role that African American women had in shaping the lives of all African Americans. When he wrote, quote, "This volume is respectfully dedicated to the women of our race, and especially to the devoted, self-sacrificing mothers who molded the lives of the subjects of the sketches, laboring and praying for their success," end quote. Simmons understood the invaluable contribution that African American families, especially women, played in supporting black soldiers. But rather than limit the discussion of these people to the portion of the book like the dedication, they deserve to be the entire study of a book. The Civil War was neither just a conflict between two armies, nor was it solely about political disputes that spanned regions or races. It was a war that provided African Americans with the ability to demand equality in American society, but doing so had the capacity to create, unfortunately, lasting problems for the soldiers and their families. Now, historians tend to focus on isolated moments of USCT soldiers' lives, either wartime or post-war. And I want to be clear, they are important, and to illustrate various hardships that they, and usually only focusing on their blood-related kin, experienced. Wartime studies illuminate how racial discrimination in service made the military experience for African American men dramatically different from all others. Some detail how white officers readily meted out physical punishment against black soldiers because of their supposed inferiority and untrustworthiness, were thought to have deserved cruel punishments. Margaret Humphreys, meanwhile, denotes that due to racially discriminatory policies based on pseudo-racial science, that USCT soldiers primarily performed fatigue duty in harsh climates which led to them dying from disease and illness more than from Confederate weaponry. Veteranhood scholars, meanwhile, stress that white pension agents discriminated against and routinely denied many African American Civil War pension applicants, primarily on the conviction that they lied. And just so we're on the same page, at one point, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, the majority of the United States federal budget were pensions. That's how important they were. Presidential elections were connected to pensions. To date, other than my book, James G. Mendez is the only scholar to place Northern African American families and the soldiers at the centerpiece. And that book is called A Great Sacrifice. It came out with Furman University Press 2 years ago. It's a phenomenal book. I cannot stress it enough. Again, A Great Sacrifice. Though he is focusing primarily on the mothers, wives, sisters, and family friends, which is important, but I go beyond them. Now, in terms of the questions I'm asking and answering, the monograph, The Family Civil War, is guided by 3 essential questions. First, and arguably most important, is I'm investigating how the enlistment of native-born African-American Philadelphian men into the United States Army created, and in some cases enduring, financial hardships that impacted individuals of multi-generational families that were left behind. Second, how did the continuance of societal racism by federal government representatives and Northerners and Southerners collectively contribute or hinder the household finances for these soldiers, later veterans, and their families in the early 20th century? And finally, who were these soldiers as people? Where did they come from? Where did they go to school? What were their families like? Who are their descendants? They matter too. Now let's jump into the work. So it is, thanks to a growing body of scholarship, it is well known that the enlistment campaign for Northern African American men in cities like Philadelphia, that war propagandists, including some very important individuals here, this is not the whole list, but this is some, Henry Highland Garnet will become actually the chaplain for the 20th USCI in New York, Anna Dickinson, and Frederick Douglass, just to name a few. I will also be talking briefly about Lucretia Mott, who is directly connected to black military service and will be the core of my second book. These individuals and others emphasize the supposed responsibilities that able-bodied African-American men had to emancipate their enslaved Southern brethren. I really hope that David Blight is not watching online, because I'm going to problematize their rhetoric. It is important, I want to be clear. Enlistment rhetoric claimed that demonstrating one's patriotic manhood would allow them to acquire full citizenship rights, including voting rights, possibly. War propagandists collectively recognized that every black soldier was going to experience racial discrimination. Even so, potential recruits were told to focus on ending slavery while simultaneously proving African American manhood paralleled their white counterparts. In doing so, war propagandists believed that it could lead to USCT soldiers and arguably all African Americans possibly attaining post-war rights such as suffrage rights and the protection of their civil rights, while refuting negative racial stereotypes, but it all had to be done through military service. The removal of these able-bodied African American men unfortunately hindered an ongoing economic crisis for working poor African Americans living in places where racial discrimination impacted their lives every second of every day. In some cases, unfortunately, their financial woes continued well into the 20th century. Now, this next line is personal for me because, again, I come from someone who served. Military service did not exist in an isolated moment of an individual's life while they served. Although different from soldiers on the front lines, the families of the soldiers I study also dealt with the consequences of military participation, as the effects had the ability to reverberate to the home front in ways that nobody, including the soldiers, could have ever dreamed. The notion that serving in a black regiment would demonstrate the plausibility for creating a racially egalitarian society, though it could only occur if black soldiers and defenders of the nation would sacrifice their lives for a country that legalized slavery and an onslaught of violence against any black person. completely ignored the fact that these men would have to serve and most likely die, and what that would mean for their families left behind. Because anyone by 1863 that serves was most likely going to get some kind of a disability or not make it out alive. And that's an unfortunate truth. Nor was there any recognition of how the families would be impacted, and at the same time, surviving the war did not, unfortunately, improve the socioeconomic standing for many of the enlisted men or their families. Now, there's a lot of questions as why call it the Family Civil War? Here's one. So, I guess on your right is an image, which I'll talk about in a second, of the 1838 burning of Pennsylvania Hall. It's a big deal. Philadelphia is the ideal location, I believe, to examine free Northern African Americans who navigated a city with extreme partisan and racial politics where racial violence was common. So in 1838, that building was burned to the ground after a long process of threats. What triggered, eventually, these white Philadelphians to do this was seeing white and black women who are abolitionists walking arm in arm down the street. After that, that building was burned to the ground. But they weren't done. Then they turned their attention to burning black schools, churches, homes, and institutions. In the aftermath, the Philadelphia police arrested the local black community and said that it was their fault that it all started to begin with. So as I try to explain to my students, when you talk about systematic racial discrimination in the legal system, it has a long, messy history. And I call it the Family Civil War because these people were born into a race war that they had no idea they were going to experience. And long before they put on those uniforms, they were fighting to survive. Men, women, and children. Now, I also believe it's important to focus on Philadelphia because it had one of the largest free black populations in 1860 with over 22,000 individuals, which represented about 4% of the city's total population. It also had some of the nation's most prominent abolitionists, including Octavius Cotto, who would later die in a race riot connected to an election in 1876. But as a young man, he supported the USCT soldiers and went to school with some of them. Lucretia Mott will be another individual who I'll show an image of next. She will donate the land that becomes Camp William Penn. So this space is really important. But I also don't want to dismiss the enslaved and freed experience. I have family roots of people being enslaved in this state. The story of enslaved people and freed people always matters. But we need to also look at what life was for free-born people as well. Now, Pennsylvania, at least for this first book, I'm only going to focus on the first three regiments, the 3rd USCI, the 6th, and the 8th, who all trained in Philadelphia, where the majority of the recruiting took place. And in essence, Civil War military service was inescapable for really any Philadelphian by 1863, as the militarization of the city and its populace pressed onward to support the United States. However, many people advocating for African American men to enlist into the Army seem to either ignore or downplay the harsh reality of life that all African Americans experienced due to racially discriminatory policies pervasive in the North and South and the Midwest, as they lived through it every day fighting for their survival, literally and economically. In total, I am looking at 185 native-born Philadelphian men who served in one of these three regiments, though there actually was 11 regiments that Pennsylvania will have. That'll be the second book. To be clear, this number does not even comprise 1% of the city's African American population. And since each regiment usually capped at 1,000 enlisted men, the total number I'm looking at comprises about 6% of the collective regiment population. But I want to be clear. Every one of their lives mattered. These men were never merely cannon fodder. They were never merely military laborers or emancipators. These were fathers, brothers, cousins, sons, and friends to a marginalized segment of Philadelphians residing in households where individuals, sometimes as young as 5 years old, had to contribute to their household finances to stave off poverty, if only temporarily. One of those will be a soldier who will enlist. His name was Francis Hawkins. He will say that he repeatedly had to drop out of school, not because he didn't value education, but because his family was desperate for the money. And he talked about this when he was in his 60s. So that's how important it was to him. He never forgot that trauma. But this isn't just about the soldiers. This book is really about the soldiers and their families. And I'm looking at them from 1850 into the 1930s. And collectively, this is actually looking at nearly 1,000 individuals. And by using a term of fictive kin, I actually acknowledge that these were interracial families, because some of these soldiers were raised in white households, which complicates the history of Philadelphia, where racial violence was pervasive. And I also think it's important to acknowledge that this group of individuals are unique. They do not represent the Northern or the Black experience at all. They speak for themselves only, because they had a unique relationship to the United States military and the federal government, which through those connections gave them potential access to the first federally sponsored social welfare program, that being a Civil War pension. And at least 79,000 African American men will serve in northern regiments, and a number of them, including the soldiers I look at, will live in sizable populations of racial minorities living outside of the Confederacy. Now, primarily due to the continuance of occupational racial discrimination, racism that the men dealt with in service, and racially discriminatory policies throughout the Civil War application process for both invalids or veterans and their nuclear dependents, collectively jeopardized the finances of many of these families. And these effects were felt far beyond what the federal government, war propagandists, or even the soldiers themselves will state. And just to give you an example, desertion will be at its highest rate within the first week of enlistment, because a number of Black soldiers will go, I'm out. Or as I tell my students, if we look at this from an employer and an employee relationship, if you haven't been paid in 9 months, I'm quitting my job. So if we take that perspective and looking at these soldiers who are being begged by their families, where's the money? Come home. We need money. I'm out. So they're not cowards. These are men with families. But I also want to be clear that this project is not just a Civil War history. This is a history of gender, a history of disability, a history of African American stories as well. Because I seek to put my work in conversation with W.E.B. Du Bois, Theodore Hirschberg, and others to talk about, we need to, and I'm saying this is the academic critique coming out, we need to stop isolating our subfields and recognize that we can all work together. I'm a gender historian who does African American history that happens to look at the Civil War. That's how I frame myself. Now, this is the primary sources that I use to do the work. I would happily talk about these, so if you have questions, and I probably should have brought a couple images, I'm happy to share a PDF scan of these pension records. They are phenomenal. Black people's voices are in there in a major way. Because when I was in grad school, I remember someone saying, well, we can't find, where are Black women's voices? They're in the record. They are the most pervasive in the record and explicit demands to be remembered. So when we talk about monuments, these people were living monuments who were saying long after the war, do not forget us. I'm going to spoil the end of my book. Oh well, please buy it. A daughter will write to Eleanor Roosevelt in 1939 during the Great Depression and say in the correspondence, my mother is sadly dying of cancer and needs a pension. I also have cancer. My dad is gone. Please help us. Eleanor responds in 7 days. I can't get people to answer an email in 2 weeks. And it's in that pension record where my hand was shaking that I have a letter from the First Lady's desk writing to this woman in which she says, you and your husband have done so much for Black people. Can you help me? And Eleanor says, oh, we're going to get an answer. And they do. I'll let you see how it plays out, but what I want you to understand is these pension records are phenomenal. They're absolutely phenomenal. You never know what you're going to find in them. In fact, I got in trouble once because there was a photograph that wasn't supposed to be there, and the archivist said, don't touch that, and I said, whoops, too late. So that's the thing, it's like, they're phenomenal. But I also want to talk about compiled military service records. If you have access to Ancestry.com through your database here, you can look at some of these right now, right? Like, they're not that hard to find. Regimental books are also great. The published memoirs, as I was talking with someone earlier about, city directories. This is where I found out the schools that they went to, the churches they were connected to, where they actually lived. The federal census, which I realize can be really dry, but this is actually how I found out their education, their marriage, what was their dynamics, what was their life like 50 plus years later. It's in those records, which again, I recognize can be extremely dry. Public speeches by prominent individuals, the Union League organization, there's one in Philadelphia and New York City, but also African American and white newspapers. And more specifically, the Christian Recorder, which was connected to the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, which is still in publication, I believe, and the Weekly Anglo-African, publishing out of New York City. Black soldiers wrote all the time in those editorials about their experiences, including in the post-war saying, "I'm done with service. I don't want to be in Texas. We won the war. Why am I in the Carolinas?" And that's one of the things that I'm trying to also unpack. Juneteenth is very important. Don't want to dismiss that. But the records from the soldiers themselves, they're not talking about Juneteenth. They're talking about their families, and they want to go home. And the only reason that they're there is because of racist policies by the United States government and military that say they deserve to be there because white soldiers deserve to go home. So it's really messy. Juneteenth is important. But it's also, we need to understand on the ground level from those family members, they're wanting these people to come home. So now I'm going to give you one real quick example. I have many, and then I'm just going to cut it short so we have more time for a conversation. In 1842, Andrew White, the son of Sarah and an unnamed man, was born in Philadelphia. Sarah, for undisclosed reasons, became a single mother raising 4 children, including Andrew, by herself when she married James Reeves on an undisclosed date. In total, the couple would raise 7 children, which created a significant economic burden on the family, as James was the only documented full-time wage earner working as a laborer, which was very common, unfortunately due to racial discrimination, to support his family. Now, perhaps Sarah found part-time work to bolster the family economy in between raising the kids, which happened a lot, and also highlights the racist and gender discrimination that the census had towards women. And when they'd say things like keeping house, that's dismissing the important roles that they do. None of the 7 children, at least according to the record, attended school even though they were school age. Their absences from school, to be clear, was not unique, as many other working poor Northern African Americans chose not to send their children to racially segregated schools, where they were inferior in nearly every manner to their white counterparts, even though city policy mandated that black people pay the taxes for the creation of white schools. These black schools had unqualified and openly racist teachers, and also were overcrowded, and they were just horrible. Other families needed their children to forego a formal education and required children, sometimes as young as 5 years old, to find work, including being chimney sweeps. And I often talk about Mary Poppins because it plays it up, but they would literally take a child, usually a black child or an immigrant child, and stick them down a chimney chute and just use them like a human scrub. And what they would ingest is coal that would kill them before their 30s. That was a very sad and unfortunate reality that many black children did for their families to survive. It is entirely plausible that the Reeves children, including Andrew, had these experiences which illustrated that race defined one's access to education and a social hierarchy that ignored an individual's age. Now for Andrew, reaching young adulthood forced him to assume more familiar responsibilities after James was no longer able to work after he incurred a hernia and a rupture due to an exposure while working again as a laborer. Andrew was able to find work as a farm laborer, earning $8 per month, and that number is important, $8 per month. And every dollar went back to his entire family. His familial obligations were well known to many members of the local community. Jason Seaman and Henry Ellis, both childhood friends of Andrew, later testified that he was critical as the provider for the entire family after his father's afflictions materialized. As a bachelor, Andrew assumed the idealized male role as the breadwinner, even though his stepfather resided in the home. Perhaps this gave Andrew a conflicted understanding of gender ideology that many middle-class Americans, white and black, championed. Alternatively, maybe what mattered more was keeping his family economically stable, which meant that materialities for this particular family were more important than Victorian-era gender roles. All right. So, on the right, your right, is the image for Camp William Penn that is going to be the basis of my second book, which is going to talk about African Americans throughout Pennsylvania using those military spaces to demand inclusion into the national family. For example, many black civilians got married on that campsite, which is not normal. Also, that land was created because of Lucretia Mott donating that family plot. The image on the right is the regimental flag connected to the regiment, and as I've written in some other pieces, black women created those flags. They never got the opportunity to speak at those events, but they were pivotal in the creation of them. And as I argue, that means that they were brought to the front lines all the time. So if you take Glory and they say, will you let that flag drop? They're also talking about the black women connected to that as well, which deserves much more attention. Now, eventually, Andrew answered the United States mobilizing call, and he will enlist in the 6th USCI on August 12th of 1863. Records do not reveal what his motivations were for enlisting. Unfortunately, what we do know is that his family did not receive the federal $100 enlistment bounty, as it would only occur after his service ended if he survived. The Reeves family was not without their breadwinner, which meant that their finances unfortunately became extremely chaotic as patriotism and militarized manhood trumped familial responsibilities. Now, serving in the United States Army did not stop Andrew from desiring to remain close to his family. So on March 25th of 1864, he wrote to his mother, and while he was at camp near Yorktown, Virginia, in the hopes of reconnecting. In the letter, he exclaimed his adoration for his family that he loved and missed dearly. But he also complained about money and how the lack of money was making it extremely hard for him to communicate with them. When he wrote to her and he said, quote, "Dear Mother, I hope you do not think hard of me for not writing you any sooner, but I could not get any money to write you any sooner because paper is very hard to get here without money." End quote. Now, perhaps this complaint about an inability to afford paper was due to the inefficiency of military paymasters, which were bad at paying any soldier in a timely fashion. In fact, they were considered the most hated person in camp when they didn't have money and the most loved person when they did have money. But in the case of black soldiers, they're not going to be paid for 9 months. That's a big problem and will lead to a lot of military disobedience. He then beseeched his mother to write him and keep him updated on how his family was doing. In the same letter, he also talked about his desire to fight in armed combat. And he said without it, his service was incomplete. When he said, quote, "I have not been in a fight yet, but I have been in some very hard marches, some very hard marches for a fight, but the rebel was afraid to stand up," end quote. Now, Andrew's proud tone reveals that his and the regiment's manhood was on full display, while Confederates, in his opinion, were fully devoid of masculine honor for their unwillingness to fight. Maybe his family took pride in the bravery and confidence that he showed, but it also meant that he pined to sacrifice his life. Now, I'll just say that this is not the battle I'm talking about. This is actually the Battle of Olustee, which this is going to make national news pretty soon. It's already starting to get a big deal in Florida because this battle is where a large majority of black soldiers will die, and it is not honored by the National Park Services, and they know that black soldiers are buried on these grounds. So this is actually something that you're probably going to see in the future gaining more traction. Now, unfortunately, Andrew's wish came true as he received an injury at June 30th of 1864 at the Battle of Point of Rock in Virginia, where he would later die of his injuries. Once the news came home, his mother promptly applied for a mother's pension, and she did receive it. She received a payment of $8 per month. and the $100 federal enlistment bounty. She would receive a pension for the remainder of her life. 1886, the pension increased to $12 per month. In 1896, it was $33 per month. But to be clear, as historian Larry Logue has demonstrated, these payments were meant to supplement one person's income, not an entire family. Members of Sarah's local community, such as H. Powell, stated that throughout the late 19th century, that Sarah frequently depended on the kindness of her neighbors to survive. When he said, quote, "She is a widow, over 70 years of age, and quite decrepit. She has been supported by the charitable people of her neighborhood," end quote. Additionally, Sarah resorted to selling candies and cakes to bolster her family's finances whenever possible. And since she was the only documented full-time wage earner in her household, it was feasible that it was rarely, if ever, enough to provide for an entire family. Now, I'll just circle back to when I mean the family civil war. Becoming a pensioner did not stop the federal government from representatives, primarily white men, from investigating the private life of Sarah and arguably anyone that desired to receive a pension. In the case of Sarah, shortly after James died of pneumonia in 1886, pension agents began an invasive examination of his employment and disability history to determine if Sarah should keep her pension or if she had been defrauding the federal government all along. And there would have been massive penalties for that. Thomas Hoffman and Henry Gamble both testified that it was James's disabilities and not a dereliction of his supposed male responsibilities that kept him from working. Multiple childhood friends of Andrew confirmed that he was the sole full-time wage earner for the entire family, which confirmed Sarah's dependency financially upon her now deceased son. Now, after the intrusive inquiry by the federal government, Sarah's pension continued for the remainder of her life. But it was only after questioning her validity and documenting her hardships to appease the skepticism of these pension agents. And in the end, Andrew continued contributing to his family even after death. But it is plausible that his family would have rather had him return home safely instead of receiving financial compensation for his passing. And I'll just close with this one point. I love this picture. African American men may have been national heroes to some, as they included themselves in national politics and the reframing of gender ideology, including for black women. They will use the opportunities to demand what their communities always knew, that they were women. However, it is vital that we recognize who these men were as individuals beyond their military service. African American families, unfortunately, rarely matter to the national wartime narrative, other than as supporters of the war effort or for the soldiers sacrificing their lives. The struggles of that families experienced, unfortunately, was of minimal consequence or significance to war propagandists or even the military. While the federal government did supplement the finances of some invalids and some nuclear dependents, it only came with an overwhelming inundation of scrutiny into the personal lives of African Americans well into and arguably long after the 1930s. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments. I sense we've just scratched the surface, so we now have 10 or 12 minutes or so for question and answer. We have a microphone here. If anyone in the audience has any questions, please make your way down. And Dr. Pinheiro indicated to me that he's particularly keen to hear from anyone, either military veterans themselves or those from military families who might have some reflections or questions. And I'll start with just a quick one as folks might make their way down. I can tell you're deeply passionate about this subject matter. So I would just invite you to talk a little bit about your own experiences and how they have fueled and motivated your own research, and how doing this research has perhaps informed your own life experience.
So part of it is a way for me to understand my family story. All right, so my mother was a single woman raising 3 children, served for 25 years, and saw combat. So I use even talking about the history of military service in a gendered way. And I'm saying, is she my mom? Because society says that's a man's job. But to me, she's my mother. And when people look at her and say, thank you for your service, and never once took a moment to acknowledge the pain that her children, her mother, her family dealt with, including issues with trying to navigate the pension process, the bureaucracy of the federal government, those stories mattered, and I just basically transposed my anger, really, not at my mom, I love my mom, hey mom, my anger was more at the federal government and the military. And what I mean is, when my mother would get deployed, I would get sent off with another family member, because she was a single woman. So she would get deployed to Rome, and I'm living with grandma, mom comes back, hey, where are you, lady? Right, and then it's like she's trying to reimpose, and it was just this real, there was a lot of tension. But once I got to grad school, I remember I called her one day, I was like, I am so sorry. Like, I get it now. Like, you did so much, and you matter. As a person, you in uniform did so much, but you were my mom. So it's like taking that, I transposed to these people. I love the Civil War. Glory is a great movie. I can quote it word for word, though I have a lot of problems with that film. One of is that it ignores that black women were always in military spaces. There's one scene where there's like black women, and they're just like, they're there, but they're not visible. If you read the records, including of soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts, they say repeatedly, black women are always here. And they are arguably the most important recruiters for the war effort. Congressmen will say that. Douglas will say that. Officers will say that. Soldiers say that. So why aren't we, as society, acknowledging how prominent and important black women were to the Civil War? Right, so it's just like, for me, a lot of Civil War historians don't like me because I'm always like, let's talk about that a little different. Right, like the Civil War matters, but let's talk about them as people. Let's talk about what they've given up. Because what I walked away with my records, it was not what I pitched for my PhD. I swore to my professor, I was like, all right, I'm going to talk about the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, Reconstruction, all that. In the record, it was unemployment, violence, including PTSD, domestic violence, like medical disability, demands to be seen and heard. And she said, fool, that's your project. I was like, oh, of course. So I think that's the other thing to realize is to be flexible with what the records say, but also to read for the silences. Black women are always in those records. They're very vocal, but sometimes they're on the background, because the great thing about the pensions, and I'll close with this, they get testimony from everybody, including neighbors. So most times if I'm giving testimony on your case, I'll be like, I know I'm here about him, but let me tell you my story real quick. So I have like a 30-page interview with, I want this federal government representative to hear my story. So I argue what's called the family's cause, debunking the lost cause if you look at the federal government records, because they've been there since the war and acknowledging black military service existed even when society said it didn't. Sorry, I do the academic thing of rambling.
Are there questions from the audience?
Yes, thank you for the book and your presentation tonight. Excellent, very excellent. And I would say that being a military son, a lot of what you said really I relate to, even in my period of life now, in that I was born in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So, and the fact that my father served World War II, and the Korean War. And I can say because of his service, connecting with your the family connection, I am where I am today because of the benefits of his hard labor and work. But there are other questions, and there are other situations that today need to be faced. Your exposition tonight would be challenged, and the political arena today. There would be some people who would say that you're crossing the line of critical race theory rather than information and enlightenment. And in seminary, we run across hard sayings. The Bible's full of hard sayings. Everybody don't want to hear them. But they're hard, but they're true. So as I listen and hear and have lived some of the situations, then I'm wondering, why in the world is it that we have people who don't want to hear the hard truth? It's true, but they don't want to hear it. And as James Cone said, until you face it, until you deal with the reality, then the future is still uncertain. We'll never get past it. We'll never change the future if we won't deal with the present realities. So my question is, how do we, in your academic, and like you, I feel it.
Correct.
How do we get through this maze? And your book's going to help.
I hope.
And I'm looking for the second one, but then I'm going to challenge you to deal with Woodrow Wilson also in the integration of the soldiers and the reality of why he did it. Because a lot of people don't know why he did it. So how do we deal with where we are and the tensions that we live in, the realities that they're there, educational information that will be denied in schools? And I want to say this, it's hard for me, a grown man. It's hard when you've been told you can't go into libraries, when you're targeted as a troublemaker. So how do we deal with this information, and how do we deal with the realities that we're in Greenwood, Spartanburg, Furman, and then another thing, we really need to get into the HBCUs too.
Well, I'll just say first, I taught at HBCU. Thank you for your points. It was a great experience for me. That's why I learned how to be a better teacher. I mean, to be honest, I thought I could teach, and I went to HBCU, and I had to learn. And I was grateful for it. You brought up a lot. So, yeah, the thing when I talk to most people about CRT is, I usually ask them, do you know what it is? Right? Because it's a legal concept, right? And it's been, through conversations, distorted, and there's a history of how this was, as I was watching a report not too long ago, connected to the push towards segregated schools in the 50s and 60s. So there's a history to all of this. I will say that I have the privilege of, I've talked to people across the spectrum, right? They're political, religious, various identities. And I've always been shocked, to be honest, that even if they don't agree with some of the points I'm getting at, they understand that at its core, I want to talk about them as people. So when I've talked to veterans, those who serve and their families, I've presented at UGA, I did one recently at Richmond, and veterans are crying, which then I cry. And normally when I do this presentation, I get emotional because it's I've been with these families for 10 years of my work, so it's I feel for them, I feel their trauma, but I also want to flip it, and there is a lot of agency. And that's a key critique for my book. Someone was well, this comes across as just a big sob story. which really pissed me off. Because I was like, this is someone who doesn't do gender or like any type of like African American, like minority history. I said, yes, it's easy to look at them as victims if we look at it from the lens of larger white society at that time. However, it is to me empowering how they never give up, how they continue to demand, how one daughter writes to the First Lady and gets multiple responses. That is truly inspiring. And I'm not gonna lie, like my book is gonna depress, like there's some parts that are really hard. I remember calling my mom and just being like, I was crying. Because it's like, I trace these people over decades, and to see how it ends for some of them, it's really depressing. But then on the flip side, it's like, that I'm here right now talking to you about them is truly inspirational. I love my job, because as I tell my students, it's a privilege to be here. I understand that it's a privilege. Because my students freak out when I'm like, look, I'm gonna keep it real. I didn't go to college straight out the gate. I was homeless. Like literally homeless at one point. And then I got my life together and people supported me and never gave up on me. And I get to sit on this stage right here and talk about these people, like they keep me going on the hard days. Right, so it's like finding, like I get that history isn't for everyone, but it's like what you can learn from their stories, and it is a way to talk about, recenter conversations. The conversations now are about monuments, right? And it's like, and when people ask me, I'm usually like, I don't really care personally. Like, because when I bring up the monument conversation, it's, did you know that most of them actually were created in the height of Jim Crow, and they were visible demonstrations of white supremacy? That's a fact. So they're not, most of them weren't created following the post-war. So they represent a multitude of things, primarily racial discrimination. And that violence and all of its threats are connected to the public memory of the war. However, if we look at these people, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, their parents, we understand that they are inspiring. Like to me, it's like these soldiers were fighting long before they put on that uniform. And to me, this book is about black women. Like it really, this is a love letter to the importance of black women who don't get enough credit for their role in the Civil War. They're usually, and I'm critiquing the field, they're usually painted like Susie King, like there's the super black person, like they represent the black experience. Like someone once wrote that Frederick Douglass represents the black experience. No, he doesn't. He's on his own pantheon. Well, like, and I got love for him, but like he does not represent. And these people I talk about do not represent. They represent themselves. But we need to talk about their mothers, their wives, and you want to talk about the messy, it was the PTSD. That's what I wasn't ready for. Reading correspondences and testimonies of neighbors doing watch, basically like neighborhood watch, because the soldiers would try to kill their wives. And I don't want to trigger anyone, but like the violence that they would manifest at home was real. And it became real. One of the soldiers will choke his wife nearly to death. They said almost like yearly. So people would wait for screams and then bust down the door. He tried to burn his children's ears off repeatedly. He would be put into an insane asylum, and they would never go visit him again. And trying to unpack that part really complicated it because we talk about them as heroes, which they can be. But this guy was a domestic abuser. So what is he? And it's like, so trying to just unpack those layers, we understand that that family was in a war against someone that they loved because the war came home to them in a different way. And it's like I'm saying, like, so it's like, I want to be clear, like, I am not saying that my book is the answer. I'm just hoping to open up the conversation that this isn't just about black families. This is about people. When I presented internationally, there are people who are like, I could use this work to talk about those who served in the Irish Brigade, those who served in World War II, you name it, like that's the point. I don't think what I'm doing is that groundbreaking and saying, you matter just like you matter, just like you matter. And if we put all of you together, we get the real story. It's not just you in uniform. There were people crying and mourning and praying for your success and safety. There were people writing and taking care of you. Right? So it's like to me, what's important.
Well, I hate to conclude on a note of disagreement, but your work is groundbreaking. And we are so grateful to have had you here. We need to transition. We are not done with the evening, and I know you have questions. We just need to transition from here to our reception, which is out in the main area in the concourse here. I know some of you may have questions and want to continue this discussion, so we will do that at this point. Thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you all.
Appreciate Dr. Pinheiro.
Thank you.